Our topic tonight, as you all know, is the diplomacy of Ubuntu and taking advantage of the lesson of Nelson Mandela on how to solve global problems and global conflict, which is an interesting theme, of course. When we think of South Africa, so many things go through one's mind. Your beautiful Cape Town is one of them. But of course, then the size of South Africa, the strength of its economy, some of its internal problems, which we all recognize, the difficulties of a one-party state, always the difficulty of creating a rainbow society. But of course, probably looming largest for most Americans is the enormous magnanimity of Nelson Mandela in the reconciliation period, moving from apartheid. And the idealism that's represented there and the vision is striking. The ambassador's career has been an interesting one as well. In his political life, he's been a member of parliament. He, as a young boy, high school, was in the ANC. He's held offices within the ANC. Within his province, Western Cape, he's held heads of department offices in economics and development, and in health and social welfare as well. And he's been premier of Western Cape province. And of course, that's like being governor of Maryland. And he's been recognized as having been very successful, a lot of direct investment from abroad. And I know he's proud of meeting the Millennium Development Goals, topic which we've covered here at the Council on a couple of occasions, a very ambitious American-sponsored program. But he also has been very active socially. And he's the founder of the World for All Foundation, which attempts, among other things, to come up with good ideas for Muslims and interfaith groups for ameliorating possible conflicts. So both the Mandela image and your own very strong social consciousness and strong strain of idealism informs your topic for this evening. It's my enormous pleasure to present the Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa, Ebrahim Rasool.
Thank you very much, President on the Council for Foreign Affairs, Frank Bird, and thanks very much to the leadership of the Council and to all of you who could have each one done so many different things on a beautiful evening like this, and you chose to come here. And I think it has a lot to do with the kind of intriguing topic that Frank squeezed out of me. And suddenly I find myself having to deliver on a topic that deals with the diplomacy of Ubuntu and the lessons that Nelson Mandela holds in solving global conflicts in the world today. But maybe I should really start at a completely different place and tell a little story just to calm my nerves. And it's the story of a man who one very dark night walks down the street, and under a street lamp he sees another man crouching. And in a fit of generosity, he goes up to the man and he says, have you lost something? Can I help you? And he says, well, I've lost my car keys. And they scour the area for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and they find nothing. And he says to the man, listen, we've now looked everywhere in this area. Are you sure you lost your keys here? And the man replies, he says, I don't think I lost it here, but this is the only place where the light is shining. And that really, I think, is the story of the world. I think we all have a dread, we all have a sense that we may have lost our keys, but none of us have the courage to look for the keys where the lights aren't shining. We don't have the courage or the support to go outside the traditionally lit up areas to find answers to our problems in the unlit areas, in the gray areas of life, in the nooks and crannies where tradition hasn't lit it up, where orthodoxy has no answers, and where our own history has not sent us to. And so, the task that we have in the world today is possibly to hold each other's hands in a sense of compassion, in a sense almost of mutual courage building, and to say, how do we hold each other and support each other as we leave the traditionally lit up areas which have no answers for us to find our keys in the darker areas of the world. We have gone through such a period where if we only relied in South Africa 20 years ago on the things we knew, we would have lit up the world in unfortunate ways with the fires of mutual destruction, fueled by our hatred between black and white. We needed someone to take our hand and to show us that in the areas which are unlit, there are beautiful possibilities. Possibilities of reconciliation. Possibilities of building unity between people who had no right to be united. Of building mutual support and mutual constructive work. Because the one thing we had in common was our love for South Africa. We understood, as Nelson Mandela taught us, that sometimes people do terrible things in the name of love for their country. White people were prepared to do terrible things to blacks in order to own the country that they love. And black people would fight to the bitter end to regain the country they loved. And sometimes the answers are obvious, that if we love our country so much, we should be prepared to do what it takes to preserve as much as possible. And certainly as black people, we were absolutely determined that we did not want to inherit a wasteland. And that, I think, is what, over 20 years ago, was what people today describe as the miracle of South Africa. I remember sitting in a meeting on the eve of the negotiations between Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress on the one side, and President F.W. de Klerk and the National Party, who had led South Africa to apartheid, on the other side. And we were all trying to box Mr. Mandela in, to tell him what he could concede to and what he couldn't concede to, what are the top lines and what are the bottom lines. And Mr. Mandela's reply was very simple. He said, if you negotiate, you must be prepared to compromise. And sounds so simple. And yet, you've experienced how elusive it is. No one negotiates to emerge at the end of the negotiation with what they originally had in mind. Anyone who did that was either posturing or was blatantly dishonest. And when that penny dropped for us, we understood that this was going to be the most exciting road we were going to be on. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental lessons that I think makes people call South Africa a miracle. It's because it's counter-instinctive. It is not how we usually do things. It comes from a completely different angle altogether. It catches you by surprise. And for those of you who watched the film Invictus, and I'm amazed how often it plays on Comcast. But for those of you who have seen the film Invictus, where Morgan Freeman plays Nelson Mandela, and Nelson Mandela has this task on a simple matter: should the South African rugby team, which is football without pads, should the South African rugby team have the right to use the symbol of the springbok, which had been a symbol of white male virility, as they asserted themselves over blacks in South Africa? They showed their prowess in the world by being powerful in this powerful game called rugby. And black sportsmen were absolutely determined to cut this virility in half and to destroy the myth of white virility and supremacy and deny them the use of the springbok. Nelson Mandela spent hours in a meeting persuading young hotheads to allow them to use the springbok. And Morgan Freeman captures it brilliantly in Invictus when he says, for Nelson Mandela, he says, "Let us surprise them with our generosity." Let us surprise them with our generosity. And that, I think, is probably the core missing ingredient in the world of politics, local, domestic, national, and global today. The absence of generosity in our dealings with each other. Now, what evokes generosity? Is generosity something you just invoke from somewhere? Is generosity a quality that you turn on and off? Or is it a state of the heart? And Nelson Mandela taught us that generosity comes from putting yourself in the shoes of the other. If I was a white person in South Africa, 1990, what would my heart be filled with? Not simply hatred. That's the easy cliche to pull on. It's probably fear. And therefore, the source of the fear, black majority rule, should we not exercise our responsibility to diffuse the fear in the hearts of our interlocutors? And at the same time, to teach the white community that what overwhelmed blacks' desire to be owners of the land was systematic, long-term deprivation and dispossession. Dispossession of the land, dispossession of rights, dispossession of wealth, dispossession of the social means in our country, and that therefore, if South Africa was going to work, we needed a bargain. How would we exchange generosity from white people to purchase patience from poor people? Because what black people wanted could not be realized overnight. And as we now looking back and using the art of hindsight, it could not even be achieved over 20 years. So what we needed on the one side was patience. What we required on the other side was generosity, the desire to share what you've accumulated over many, many centuries. And in that moment was exemplified the spirit and the philosophy that comes from Africa and that has lived in South Africa, called Ubuntu. U-B-U-N-T-U, Ubuntu. Its core word is person or personhood. But it is not simply person in the individual, because the way Nelson Mandela translates it is I am because you are. The way Archbishop Tutu translates it is, we are people through other people. Meaning that I only realize myself in relation to you. I diminish myself when I subtract from you or humiliate you, and I enhance myself when I enhance your dignity. And so was born this notion of interdependence and interconnectedness of human beings. And so I thought it useful to begin to locate our keys by understanding what was at the core of the human psyche that made that miracle possible in South Africa in 1994. And we would be very reluctant to utilize the term miracle because lots of people across the world admire the South African miracle. And I already become suspicious because the moment they call it a miracle, they say, you could do it, but we can't. Because it's God-given. You know, such an act only comes from God. So don't expect us as Israelis or us as Palestinians to do what you did because you had a miracle. Don't expect the factions in Syria to do what you did because you had a miracle. And the point is that what we did may have been divinely inspired, but it was humanly done. It was an act of agency by people on both sides of the divide that made it possible. And if it could be done in a South African conflict that had a 300-year genesis, it can be done elsewhere. I think that many Americans whom I have encountered over the last few weeks have carried with them a sense of some embarrassment, some regret, some anger even, that elected leaders couldn't rise above themselves and their parties. And I'm not here to judge that. I'm just explaining what I've encountered. And sometimes, when you face a situation such as the one that you faced, it is easier to personalize it. He's not leading. He's in it for his ego. He's a hostage of his faction. He can't rise above his party. And so we personalize it, we politicize it, we individualize it, and so forth. It may just be that what you've experienced may be a symptom of what I think may be a beginning point of a transition in the world, a shift in the world. Because in a sense, it is useful to combine the debates of your fiscal crisis, your shutdown, and your almost default, and tie it up to a few other debates that have preceded it and that will necessarily follow it. Immediately before that was the United States anguishing in the world about how to deal with what they saw to be a moral crisis in Syria. And so here you had a president thinking out loud, I've drawn the red line, must I stick to it? Will I be ready to do it? If I do it, how limited will it be? How short will it be in duration? Are the American people with me? How do I take them along with me? If I make this speech tomorrow night, will I push the numbers up above 25% approval for it? If I say that it's limited, will I be able to convince people that the sacrifices won't be many? Will I be able, maybe I should get Congress to concur with me so that we have an agreement on who pays the bills for it. We don't repeat the blank check of previous exercises. And so, while you personalize it, an indecisive leader, for the rest of the world, it was a fascinating insight that for the first time the United States was thinking aloud. We did not simply see its action. We had a glimpse into its thoughts. And suddenly, we could identify this transition in global problem solving. A previous generation would not have hesitated. You'd have heard the announcement, not the speech to persuade you to support it, but the speech to announce a fait accompli. We have attacked Syria tonight. Instead, we had a process that weighed up. How much resources do we have to involve ourselves in battle? And can our fiscus afford it? And how long will it be? And do we stand the danger of going into something where we don't know how fast we'll come out of it and what will be the bill at the end, on the one hand? The second thing is, do the American people have the appetite for another conflict? And so this transition I'm speaking about is a transition from a unilateral world where someone can make up their mind to go to war and commit the world to it, to a more multilateral world in which we're saying it's not good to go alone. We need to build a coalition. We need to persuade people from a leader's decision to a decision in which the opinions of people were also reckoned in. And when the dial didn't move significantly above 25%, I think that was a moment to say, how do we do things differently? And so the point that I'm making is that this is probably a seminal moment in the world today. Is it weakness or is it potential strength? Now, I think that we've grown up on a diet of strength that identifies itself in how good you are militarily, how you muscle your way forward economically, how you enforce your will. And so, what we have spawned as a consequence of that is to render notions like negotiation, dialogue, engagement, and compromise weak. So suddenly, if you negotiate, you're seen to be weak. Let alone compromise, then you're a wimp. And so what we have done, we have built up an image of strength that when people apply it in Congress, we don't like it anymore. Because strength has outfoxed itself. No one wants to blink. No one wants to come to the table with a first compromise. It's weak to be reasonable now. It's weak to be rational. Your backbone relies on an impervious, unflexible, unpragmatic strength now, rather than exercising the muscle of the mind. And so I think that what is possibly interesting for the world as we go forward is, what does the United States do with this moment? And how does the world not vilify it, but understand it as a new way forward in solving problems in the world today? And so this transition that we're in, I think, is one that we really need to manage well. I think that we've been in debate, for example, as South Africa, and solving problems in sub-Saharan Africa, at least. We've had very interesting debates with the United States historically. We've been seen as, for example, protecting Umar Bashir in the Sudan, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and a few others. And yet, when you do the balance sheet and you say, let us look that within 5 years of engaging Umar Bashir, negotiating with him, forcing him and Southern Sudan to make compromises, we had a peaceful secession of South Sudan from Sudan as a whole within a period of 5 years, with relatively less lives than a full-scale punitive war would have taken, and a full-scale civil war would have taken. I'm not saying the costs are minimal. The same with Zimbabwe. It took us 7 years from a disputed election to an election that was peaceful, possibly free, and maybe not as fair as some people would like it to be. But the fact of the matter is that the outcome of that election had a clear, decisive winner, despite the conditions, and Zimbabweans are able to construct their lives to the point that I think that the economy is beginning to pick up. And again, what was the cost in lives? What was the cost in the budget? Compare that to the problem solving in Afghanistan and the problem solving in Iraq, and count the bodies and count the budget, and evaluate whether the exits have been reached in either of them. And so this approach, like we solved the Great Lakes area, I mean, there were times when Nelson Mandela was spending more time in the Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda making peace than running his country. The same with Thabo Mbeki, our next president, spending all that time negotiating the Sudanese solution. And so I think that we've got to be able to shift, not only because we have less money for it, but I think because people's appetite for conflict has been reduced. And therefore, we've got to invest strength in soft power. How is it that we are able to do certain things, deploying soft power? We are probably going to see soft power yielding some results, hopefully, in a place like Syria and maybe even in a place like Iran. But we've got to give it a chance. It's not going to be foolproof. It's not going to be plain sailing. But I certainly think that those are the issues that I think we may need to be able to begin to conceptualize and use. Maybe that's the unlit area where our keys are to be found. And in evaluating strength and weakness on the one side, it's useful to understand the application of the Kantian approach to weighing up strengths and weaknesses. Kant make the very obvious but not known statement, because we all walk around believing that the opposite of short-sightedness is 20/20 vision. Immanuel Kant said, no, the opposite of short-sightedness is long-sightedness. 20/20 vision is the perfect middle. applied differently, the opposite of cowardice is not courage. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness. The perfect middle is courage, because it sometimes takes more courage to make peace than it takes to make war. Applied differently, the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is passivity, even in the face of evil. The perfect middle is peace, because when peace is a goal, you may need to do certain things that are not popular or palatable. And so if we begin to invert our usual thinking about these terms, then I think we begin to get new insights into how we can move forward. I think that, and no one would associate a Nelson Mandela, because everyone thinks he has a good heart, they won't associate him with good strategy. Nelson Mandela understood that what he was busy with in problem solving, even in South Africa itself, was the strategy of triangulation. Here's the protagonist, here's the antagonist, and triangulation means that you place yourself above and between the two, not equidistant between the two, above and between, because sometimes you do have a leaning to what is correct, but you don't have the right to descend to the one side that you believe to be correct in order to inflame the conflict. How do you put yourself above and between the antagonist and the protagonist in order to resolve a conflict? The opposite of triangulation, of course, would be strangulation. But certainly, in the application of triangulation, the brilliance of Nelson Mandela was that he was both an antagonist and the point of the triangulation. The ability to be, at the same time, a contending party, in our case, for non-racialism, for justice, and for peace against the apartheid government, but have so much empathy and generosity that he simultaneously placed himself above and between, because of the ability to see the feelings, the fears, the anxieties of the other, and at the same time to understand the aspirations and the impatience of your own side, and therefore to fashion a particular problem-solving mechanism in the world. The third broad element I wanted to speak about was to refuse to see the world in binary terms, because it's the most convenient terms to see the world in. Them and us. With us or against us. And binaries are the beloved instruments of the dogmatic. The Canadian-born American economist, Professor J.K. Galbraith, famously said once, "The more uncertain people are, the more dogmatic they become." The more uncertain people are, the more dogmatic they become. That's the story of fundamentalism. When Muslims in certain parts of the world see faith being eroded and new science bringing new facts to light that had not been there, and their countries being overrun and all of those kind of things, the uncertainty is so great that the certainty that they have the truth becomes so powerful that they do anything in the name of that truth. They have a license to do anything. And so while we may not be as devastating as some of those extremists and fundamentalists, and while we may not be as outrageous and spectacular in our destruction as some fundamentalists are, it does not mean that we are free of the kind of dogmatism and free of the love of binaries in the world today. And so, for example, a mistake may have been made by seeing the emergent post-Mubarak Egypt as a binary situation, Islamists and secularists, and we choose the secularists. The conflict to get out of the binary, at least add a third party to it. I think that in that part of the world, the Middle East, North Africa, and other parts of the Muslim world, we may have to distinguish between the restless, the ordinary citizens who yearn for freedom, who want democracy, who want justice, who want human rights, who want the rule of law, and be free of dictatorships and so forth. And we've got to understand who are the unsustainable in that. The kings, the monarchies, the dictatorships that have been propped up for many decades. And on the other side, the undesirables, those feeding off the impatience and the restlessness of the people on the one side and the unpopularity of the unsustainable on the other side, are the extremists waiting. And so we've got to, if we live only in a binary world, we make fundamental errors in how we may read a situation and achieve precisely the objectives we are trying to avoid. And so we need a different approach to reading situations. And so maybe we should say on a sliding scale, in places like the Middle East and North Africa, that the rump of societies are Muslim, with minorities, that some of them at the leadership may be Islamists who see Islam as being against dictators. And on the other extreme, we have extremists. And that they're not all equal. And so we need to be able to, in the unlit areas, to embrace complexity, the gray areas, and to think harder about how we do things. And so, to end, I think that as we unveiled the statue of Nelson Mandela on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., outside the newly renovated South African Embassy, exactly a month ago, we thought that what we needed to establish there was Nelson Mandela's exact moment of transition. We captured his gait as he shifted from imprisonment to freedom. As he stepped out of prison and raised his fist. That's the image that that statue captures. That's the moment at which the unknown became the known. The feared became the loved. That's the moment in which the demon, in a sense, became the angel, and the stereotype became the surprise. And that's the step that we've captured outside our embassy, partly as a gift to the people of the United States, who marched for our freedom, who didn't eat our fruit, didn't drink our wines, didn't invest in our country, withdrew their savings from the banks that invested in South Africa, and so forth and so forth. So it was in one way a tribute to the people of the United States, who sometimes, despite the decisions of the White House, decided that apartheid was bad and needed to go, and that Nelson Mandela needed to be freed. You sometimes had more faith in Nelson Mandela than we sometimes had in ourselves. And partly, that statue is a contribution to this wonderfully intellectual society that the United States is. To draw you back to your intellectualism, to remind you of your heritage, and to be able to say that the diplomacy of Ubuntu, of human interdependence and interconnectedness, may be an unknown step forward, but it's a potentially exhilarating one. That as we celebrate the great memorials that adorn the capital city, we make a modest contribution of Nelson Mandela. And we have a delicious triangulation of ourselves. Because just further down Massachusetts Avenue stands Mahatma Gandhi. And recently unveiled on the mall is Martin Luther King Jr. We think that in the comfort of that triangle of leaders who did the unexpected, who had probably more right than many to be angry, more right than many to be violent, more right than many to shun reconciliation. Those were probably three leaders who transcended themselves, transcended their parties, transcended their people and the anger that overwhelmed their people, and were able to fashion peaceful transitions within their societies. And we honor them, not as museum pieces, not as captives of an era whose time has come and gone, but we honor them as people of stature whose values remain eternal and whose time may indeed have come now in the era of global politics, when budgets are limited and appetites for conflict are diminished. Are there alternatives? And I believe that we are only stuck on the cliche because it's the only place where the light is shining. We've got to take each other's hands and say that there's potentially a wonderful place, a different kind of place in the diplomacy of Ubuntu. Thank you very much.
Good. Asked me if that was useful. I think it was. And his theme is straightforward, and there are endless complications within his presentation, of course, and interesting facets. So I rather suspect there will be some questions. The floor is open for questions at this point. Sir, the question has to do with security in Cape Town in particular. Pardon? Yes. And so the question to you is, what has been done to improve security in Cape Town?
I think that one of the residues of a 300-year history of violence and dispossession and so forth is that some of it begins to creep into, it's a way of problem solving. And so when we say there must be a different way of problem solving, it's not only at the global lofty level. I think it's something we're trying to teach our own people, to get a softness, a gentleness back into all our definitions of what a South Africa must be about. I think a second consequence of the kind of agreement made between Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk is that effectively we had taken an evolutionary path towards wealth sharing, land sharing, and all of those kind of things. And so I think that at the edges of society, impatience is a lot more apparent. And so I think that one of the pathologies that would remain would be issues around safety, crime, and so forth. I think that particularly in a place like Cape Town, and I say that having been its governor for a while, is that, and it's something that we can be proud of, but we know it's not sufficient, is the fact that we are taking particularly our human policing resources and placing it in areas where a lot of the violence and crime is most rife, and that's it's almost your inner city ones, where on a Friday night and a Saturday night, I think that we have people coming together, alcohol being one of the main drivers of it, and I think that that's where the crime statistics are at its highest. If you go to Cape Town itself, and certainly when I was there 3 years ago, I think we've got almost every street in Cape Town itself, every tourist facility, every beach and so forth, increasingly under camera and backed up by the kind of patrols that we do have. And so I think that it would be useful to have a discussion with you to see whether the experiences you've had, whether things have improved since then, because I think that what has happened in recent times, especially since we've completed the Cape Town film studios, which really are 4 sound stages with 4 to go of the most modern ones. We've just finished. You've probably all seen Safe House, or some of you may have seen it. I think Black Sail is being shot there at this moment and so forth. And so I think that we're claiming back zones, more and more zones of safety within it, precisely because we understand the value of people visiting South Africa, visiting a place like Cape Town, and that our problems should not, in a sense, become your problems. I also think increasingly we are finding that gentleness within our people. I think we've just got to minimize the desperation from some of them. But I would certainly want to sit with you or find out a bit more about when it is that you withdrew and how we can ensure that that we do things better for you.
There really were, I think, 2 questions. First, was de Klerk being prudent given the circumstances at the time in South Africa? And the second question was, is it possible that in other conflicts in the world, you do not have both the magnanimity of Mandela and the prudent observations to compromise on the part of de Klerk? And if you don't have those 2 things, what problems are created?
I think, I certainly think that from the 1970s already, there was a slow acceptance that what white South Africans had was unsustainable. I think it was part of the pain of having to get your son, as soon as he matriculated, put him on a train that took him to a border to fight in a war he did not understand and he was not mature for. And so mothers on both sides of the divide, I think, were bearing the pain of a conflict they did not understand but began to realize was unsustainable. I think that had we, close after the 70s, had a visionary leader emerged on the white side that reached out to Nelson Mandela and said, how do we avert this? I think we may have maybe not had as smooth and as short a transition, but I think it could have. I think by 1984, 83, P.W. Botha, the then president or prime minister, tried to tamper with the system, but he didn't realize that tampering with the system was no longer sufficient. You needed to change the system. But he didn't have the courage. People waited year after year for him to cross the Rubicon, and he could never bring himself to do that. I think it was only later an internal coup within the National Party that brought F.W. de Klerk. And very importantly, F.W. de Klerk took power from the most conservative side of the National Party because it works on the understanding that only the most conservative can sometimes make the most drastic changes. Because he has the confidence of his people that he will not. And Nelson Mandela understood. And part of his triangulation strategy of Nelson Mandela was the dictum, strengthen your enemy. Meaning that when you are negotiating with someone, you don't tear the skin from their face. On the contrary, you strengthen him so that he retains or she retains the confidence of their people. They've got something to take back to their people. And so, Nelson Mandela and the ANC then invented the notion of sunset clauses, where Mr. de Klerk could go back to the white community and say, they will not remove us from the command of the army for the next 5 years. We will share the government with them for the next 5 years. We will not nationalize the economy. We will not do this. So it was a way of strengthening the enemy. Taking that now and applying it, I don't think, let alone generosity and magnanimity, but I don't think that there is an abundance of strategic wisdom and insight in the world today. It's mind-boggling that the Middle East, everyone knows that the situation is unsustainable, maybe except the hardliners on both sides of the divide. That the battle in the Middle East is, in a sense, for example, some of the settlements that are being built are not to ward off change. It is to preempt change so that when change happens, that we have sufficient territory. And so, at some point, there must be a call for transcendence. Now, it can either happen through implosion or it can happen through wisdom. And I think that, and so the point that, that you make about my country, right or wrong, my country, what's it, leave it or change it. I think we need, and part of the reason that I do this diplomacy of Ubuntu in the United States is because it is the one country with the capacity that if it grasps it, it can make it happen globally. I'm not saying that to inject an arrogance into you. I'm saying that to inject a responsibility into the United States. The more you are so busy with yourselves, you lose the capacity to lean on different situations with wisdom and strategy and really the might that you have in reserve. And that, I think, is really why we have these discussions with citizens of the United States in order, I think, to bring this global, because people only do it because they think they can get away with it. The United States is not looking. Maybe
say
yeah,
something
sorry.
about your non-recognition of Kosovo.
Yeah, I think that the South Africa, almost as a principle, does not vote for third country interventions. And so, in much the same way that we did not approve of military interventions in Syria or in other countries, I think that's where that thing comes from. I think that what we need to do is really to say that, and as I think you're suggesting, that we've now transcended the how of the change to the fact of the change. And maybe what I take away from here is the idea that we've got to revisit that and not stay on where historically we have been on the issue of Kosovo, that we need to be able to understand and maybe deploy our own fact finders within the Kosovo situation in order to be able to move forward. So I think at the very best, what I am offering out of this is to get our Department of International Relations to revisit the situation in Kosovo.
What do you think your country's position will be post-Mugabe in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, I think that we certainly would look, we've got to accept that Mugabe had won an election now. So he is 90, he's the president of Zimbabwe, and theoretically he has 10 years still. Whether he lasted, it's not for us to decide. I think South Africa has withstood some of the most turbulent times in Zimbabwe, and I want to tell you that South Africa paid the highest price for Zimbabwe, because today there are 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. And we've, by and large, had to keep the Zimbabwean economy going when its inflation rate was at 16,000%. And so forth. We've had to supply it with oil, we've had to supply it with basic foods, and so forth, because the choice for us was keeping the economy going or having Zimbabwe in South Africa. And we chose to keep the economy going. So I think that having withstood the worst turbulence in Zimbabwe, I think we are ready for anything, because anything can only be an improvement from this point onwards. And I think that that what is most likely is to be able to understand that how does one begin to get President Mugabe to begin to think of succession planning within his party. And the early signs are that certainly there is a grooming process that I think is beginning to take place. The last thing on that is that sometimes we think that there are Western powers who often don't understand when enough is too much. We believe that Mr. Mugabe largely cemented that voting bloc behind him because he didn't have to answer for mismanagement in the economy. All he had to say was, no, the economy is bad because the US and the UK have imposed sanctions on me. I want to feed you. But tell Mr. Tsvangirai to tell his friends in the West to lift the sanctions. And so he won this election by explaining everything away in terms of sanctions. And he didn't have to tell the technical details of the sanctions, but just the use of the word has made him the hero as the one who stood up when his opponent, Mr. Tsvangirai, was seen to be the one who called for sanctions. And so I think that sometimes a society finds its own rhythm when you remove the external threat. And then people can evaluate it in the cold light of day and not against the backdrop of an external threat. And sometimes external threats and external actions help precisely the people you don't want to help. And that, I think, is the situation that I think we face in a place like Zimbabwe.
Mr. Ambassador, we thank you for an extraordinary evening. Thank you very much.